It's great to be here. So what I thought we could do, well, let's just get through some preliminaries. So there's Scott Crane's at the 1440 Foundation. Money makes people funny, so I'll just go through my disclosures quickly. First off, there's really no money in mindfulness training. And there's not much in research these days, so write your Congress people and tell them, research dollars over bullets or whatever. We also have a startup company that Yale started to help us take our technologies into the public sector. So we're working with some social entrepreneurs to translate this research, and we're now called Claritas Mind Sciences, but if you see this little logo, Go Blue Labs, that's what we were formerly called. I'm not going to be presenting any data specifically, but I'll be presenting a couple of slides where the company developed some technologies. So you can ignore all of that or take it with a grain of salt or think of me as however you want to think of me. I thought we could start with a little ditty to let our brains marinate in before we get started. And as we listen to this talk, see if we can come up with something together at the end. So many years after the last Indian ancestor of Buddhism named Bodhidharma had arrived in China, Dazu Hoike sought to study with the enigmatic teacher. Bodhidharma had settled into a cave and had been meditating for 9 years by just staring at the wall. At first, Bodhidharma refused to even acknowledge Hoike's presence, but Hoike was earnest and tried many things to get the teacher's attention. Eventually, out of desperation, he cut off his arm and presented it to Bodhidharma. And you can see this depiction here, minus all the blood. Upon seeing this, Bodhidharma asked him, "What do you want?" Hoike said, "My mind is not at ease. Please pacify my mind." Bodhidharma said, "Bring me your mind and I will pacify it." Hoike replied, "When I look for my mind, I cannot find it." "There," said Bodhidharma, "I have pacified it for you." So let's just see what this means as we go through this talk. So I thought we could start with some warm-up exercises to talk a little bit about why Facebook and even love is like crack. We'll move on to more substantive topics like why McDonald's has served over 250 billion, how Lolo Jones could have won the Olympic gold medal, and we'll finish with how we can all become a Buddha in 9 minutes and quit smoking too. So that's quite a tall order. But let's start with talking about ourselves. So Facebook, crack cocaine, how does this work? So I actually just discovered that I can change my Facebook to pirate. Arr. So why is Facebook like crack cocaine? Well, it turns out if you put people in the scanner and you ask them, you give them a choice, they can either earn money or they can talk about themselves. What do? They talk about themselves. I guess the researchers, these are Harvard researchers, so maybe they didn't offer enough money. But people chose to talk about themselves, and when they talked about themselves, they activated a specific region of the brain called the nucleus accumbens, which you can see here with these yellow arrows. This is the same brain region that gets activated when you smoke crack cocaine. There was another study that came out after that where they did basically the same thing. And they also gave them this Facebook score. So they tested to see how much time people spend on Facebook. And you could actually predict the amount of time that people spend on Facebook based on how much their nucleus accumbens lit up. Good times. So why are we so unhappy? Well, 99% of everything we think and everything we do is for ourselves, and there isn't one. So this goes back to the Hoike quote, why do we cause so much problem for ourselves, so many problems for ourselves? So let's move on to love. Well, it turns out the neurocorrelates of romantic love, and I won't go through all the details, are basically just like Facebook. You get the same activations in these dopaminergic regions. You can see here, well, here it's showing the insula. You can see here in the dorsal striatum, the putamen gets activated. In another study that was done with romantic love, you can see the ventral tegmental area. You don't have to remember any of this stuff, but just think of this as crack cocaine. So when people are in the throes of romantic love, same thing happens as when you're posting on Facebook and waiting for people to reply to your posts. We get all excited, we get all agitated. Now, what's the story here? So I think the rock band Nazareth puts it well. Love hurts, in a nutshell. So how does this process get set up? Why do we actually do this stuff? So let's think of, let's follow the love theme. So let's say that you get a new iPhone and you can program all your ringtones to differentiate your mom from, let's say that you just got a new love interest. So you just developed this new love interest and you program in the ringtone. And the ringtone, then they call, and how's that feel? It feels great. Your brain says, oh, my baby's calling. And your brain says, well, don't just look at your phone, pick it up. And it gets, it says, come on, pick it up before they hang up. And so you pick up the phone and they say, oh, can't wait to see you tonight. And you lay down this memory that says, oh, whenever this ringtone rings, that's good news. And it changes the way we see the world, right? So what is this process? I'm sure many of you have seen this loop. I'll give you a hint. There's a word positive in it. Anyone? There we go, positive reinforcement. Great. Okay, positive reinforcement, pretty basic. Well, this is all well and good until you break up, right? You forget to delete their ringtone. And they call and they want all their stuff back. How's that feel? Suck. And so your brain says, oh, this is terrible. I should have listened to my mom. She said never to date this person in the first place. And it just feels terrible. So it says, do something about this. And so you throw your phone against the wall and you feel better for about 10 seconds. And it also changes the way we see the world, right? So this is the other side of reinforcement, positive, negative reinforcement, right? And the idea here is the more we do these things, the more we have these skewed views of the world, the more we reinforce these habits to the point where we don't even notice the pleasant, the unpleasant. We don't even notice the wanting. We move right on to behavior. And the more we behave, the more this gets ingrained. Okay? Pretty straightforward, right? So this is where addictions form. Now, we can say, okay, positive, negative reinforcement, it's a 20th century concept. It's very straightforward. Described, I think Thorndike was one of the first to publish on it in 1898. So it's been described for a long time. Eric Kandel got the Nobel Prize for it in, I think, 2000 for his work with aplesia, showing that even sea slugs have this type of associative learning. It turns out that the Buddhists talked about this 2,500 years ago. So they didn't call it associative learning, but they laid out the very same process. So let's just walk through it. They described same thing. You get cues and triggers, and these can include thoughts. They can include body sensations. These get interpreted by the mind as pleasant or unpleasant, and this leads to craving. And they describe craving and aversion, but they're same flavor, just opposite valence. This leads to behavior. They described it as the birth of a self-identity, and this is where the me comes in, the birth of a self. And this process gets reinforced in a loop that's described as samsara. So anybody know the translation of samsara? It might be one translation that I'm not familiar with. Endless wandering. So at least in the Buddhist circles, this is described as endless wandering because this reinforcement keeps us wandering endlessly. We're never satisfied. We're never satisfied. And there's actually an image what's described as the hungry ghost, which is a ghost with a very long, thin neck and a huge belly. And you can never get enough food in through the neck to keep that belly full. And that's the idea of this endless wandering. And the problem here is me, is the self, the formation of the self. So just to bring this back to modern day, and smoking in particular, because that's one of our research interests, but also where there's a lot of evidence at every step of this, just showing this positive and negative reinforcement loop. It's interesting because as we try to develop treatments for these types of things, what we've come up with so far is avoidance strategies. So in Alcoholics Anonymous, there's a phrase, people, places, and things. You should avoid people, places, and things. So if you can avoid the input, you're less likely to have this affect and craving come up. That makes sense. If you're smoking, for example, it's harder to do that because you tend to associate smoking with all sorts of different things, including your car, your front porch, outside your workplace, and all those things. So you'd basically have to drop yourself onto a desert island. So you can use substitute behaviors, and cognitive therapies promote substitute behaviors. So eat carrot sticks instead of smoking cigarettes, which is all well and good until Easter comes around and there's a run on carrot sticks at the grocery store or whatever, and your brain says, where are my carrot sticks? And sorry, I'm not going to beat up the Easter bunny to take those carrot sticks. So your brain says, well, I'm going back to smoking. Because the key here is that these behaviors don't actually dismantle this core addictive loop. They treat around it, they avoid inputs into it, but they don't actually dismantle the loop itself. Now, it's interesting. The Buddhists described this as well. They said, just as a tree, though cut down, can grow again and again if its roots are undamaged and strong, in the same way, if the roots of craving are not wholly uprooted, sorrows will come again and again. I like this modern day interpretation, and Mick Jagger actually talks about smoking in his song, if you're familiar with it. So now on to our McDonald's. So what's the story with McDonald's? Well, it turns out, maybe they read the ancient texts. They said, we can make a lot of money from this, and we're going to flaunt it, right? And they actually have years and years of scientific research to try to create foods that are the most addictive possible. And there was a nice New York Times article, my favorite peer-reviewed journal, the New York Times. So there was a New York Times article maybe last year where they detailed all of this food science that goes into optimizing the amount of sugar and fat and the ratios there to get people addicted. And then they flaunt it because people aren't well, they eat McDonald's. Kellogg's got on board, so they developed their cereal called Crave. And if milk chocolate Crave isn't good enough, don't worry. There's double chocolate Crave. Of course, we all know where this leads, right? So what's going on here? How does this process get set up? We have an idea psychologically. Now, what's going on in our brain? And I'm going to just lay this out here simply. You don't have to remember all of this. But there are a couple of competing systems. One is this hot processing system, which involves self-referential valuation. It's impulsive. It's self-referential. It's unplanned. It's like see a Big Mac, eat a Big Mac. You know, you see the sign for McDonald's, you pull in, even if you're not super hungry. This involves midline brain structures, the medial prefrontal cortex and the posterior cingulate. We'll come back to these later. A lot of good data around that. Now, the contrast to this is the deliberative or cold processing system. It's effortful, it's logical. This is where cognitive behavioral therapies come in. Think of Mr. Spock as the epitome. You know, everything is logical. He doesn't even have emotions, at least in the early Star Trek movies. And this involves more lateralized brain structures. So the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is one of the brain regions involved there. So again, lots of detail. You don't have to remember it. Just think of this as the I want and it's not about me brain systems, okay? So how can we actually improve the balance between hot and cold processing? How can we improve our ability to tolerate the heat? Alternatively, you know, is there a way to turn down the heat in the first place so that it's not as hot? Okay, so now on, this just came out, I don't know if any of you saw this. This is from this month's Time magazine, the mindful revolution, right? So people are getting on board with mindfulness now. What the heck is this? Well, you know, Time magazine might have a lot of good wisdom in it, but I like to think more Darwinianly. So let's take a Darwinian perspective on why we should even study mindfulness. So let's think about this in terms of half-life, okay? So what's the half-life of different things? Let's just start with my favorite thing, which is the ab machine, right? So what's the half-life of the typical ab machine? This one, maybe this one, maybe this one, maybe this one. I think you get the idea. About every 6 months on the infomercials, you get a new ab machine that looks slightly different. It seems to have the same type of padding, but probably slightly in a different place. Not very long, so we'll give the ab machine 6 months. Cognitive behavioral therapy, empirically validated. You know, Aaron Beck did some really fabulous work on this. Cognitive behavioral therapy hasn't actually been around that long. It's been around about 40 years, but it's actually not on its upswing. It's plateaued, and well, I won't predict where it might go, especially since I'm being recorded. But it's certainly not, you know, it's not taking off. People aren't saying that the cognitive behavioral therapy revolution on Time magazine. So 40 years. How about penicillin? Well, it was a breakthrough. It was discovered in 1928. It's still considered one of medicine's top 10 discoveries. Great antibiotic. By 1994, 15% of strep pneumonia cases or strains were resistant. So half-life, you know, we can give that about 60 years. Psychoanalysis, we'll give it 100 years, and I won't go much more into it, but let's just say that wasn't the focus of my residency training. So mindfulness, you know, they didn't have cameras back then, but mindfulness training has actually been around for 2,500 years, and the core elements of mindfulness training are virtually unchanged. So from a Darwinian perspective, this is really interesting. What do these guys have? So if you want to think of mindfulness, you can think of it in two components. So the regulation of attention on the present moment, so you're paying attention, but there's another quality to this attention which is characterized by curiosity, openness, and acceptance. So for example, you can be paying attention to this lecture, you're satisfying criteria number one, but you could be thinking, oh, this sucks, or you're tweeting away, or you're doing whatever because you don't want to be here. So that's not mindfulness, that's judgmental attention. So there's really this idea that you have to be present, but in a way where you're not trying to be somewhere else or trying to control things or trying to change things. So where do you think mindfulness might come in with regard to the addictive loop or the associative learning loop? Anyone? I'll give you, well, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 20% chance just by pointing your finger blindly. Wanting, great. So the idea here is mindfulness can come in and help us really see what the wanting feels like and help decouple that wanting from the behavior. The idea is that you could actually dismantle this core loop. So this is really interesting because it's different than treating around it, but actually helps to dismantle it in its, ideally, if you break one piece, the whole thing will fall apart. So mindfulness-based treatments have been studied in a bunch of different ways. I won't go through all of the background. My favorite, though, is a paper that came out last year. Boost your GRE scores. Go, start practicing mindfulness. So what are we talking about here? I think one thing to really pay attention to is this paradoxical element that less is more. So if we actually just pay attention, if you just pay attention, that's all you need. Everything else will take care of itself. So here's an example of this. One of our smokers posted this on our online forum. So we actually have the people the first day pay attention, just smoke, pay attention when you smoke. And they're like, what? I thought this was an anti-smoking thing. We say, pay attention, just pay attention when you smoke. And she sums it up. She says, mindful smoking, smells like stinky cheese, tastes like chemicals, yuck. So the idea is that when you really pay attention to what you're doing, if it's not helpful for you, you will see this. And then you start to become disenchanted. You don't have to force yourself to change. You don't have to resist. You just have to pay attention. Okay, is that all there is to it? Can you actually see behavior change just by paying attention? The short answer is yes. So we did a randomized clinical trial. We compared mindfulness training to the gold standard treatment, which is the American Lung Association's freedom from smoking. We didn't even tell people that they were getting mindfulness training, that they could get mindfulness training. We said, come in for behavioral treatment for smoking. We found that it was twice as good as the gold standard treatment in the goal, and the outcome here is point prevalence abstinence, so you can use biochemical verification to make sure people aren't smoking. We got about a 36% quit rate at the end of treatment, which is the best medication out there, gives you a 43% quit rate. So we're right up there with the best medications. At our fMRI follow-up, these folks had largely maintained their gains, where the folks from the American Lung Association's group had fallen off. So we see hard outcomes. We see behavior change. 4 weeks of mindfulness training, 4 weeks of rubbing their face in it, and they actually start to change behavior. That's pretty amazing. So we asked ourselves, what's going on here? And the hypothesis is that mindfulness training would decouple craving and behavior. This wasn't our idea. We just went back to the associative learning models, and we said, where should this work? So the prediction would be that we would see a dissociation between craving and smoking before they both subside. So think of craving as a fire. Think of cigarettes as adding fuel to that fire. So if you stop adding fuel, your fire isn't going to suddenly go out. It's just going to burn out over time as the residual fuel is consumed. And you can test that hypothesis. It's testable. So you can see here at baseline, there's a good correlation between craving and smoking. The more people crave, the more they smoke. At the end of that 4-week treatment, that association is completely gone. And if you do all the fancy math, you can actually look to see what are the predictors of outcomes. Baseline craving does not predict cigarette use. Baseline cigarette use, end of treatment craving does not predict it. But if you look at the amount of informal practice people do, this significantly predicts the likelihood that they're going to quit. And it also formally mediates the dissociation between craving, it moderates the dissociation between craving and smoking. So the craving and smoking relationship is no longer there. We even see this behaviorally. So when people report their craving, at the end of treatment, the people that quit and the people that don't quit report the same amount of craving. So their craving is not different. But you can see as people quit smoking, that craving goes off. That fire starts to burn down on its own, where the people that don't quit, their craving continues and it even goes up a little bit. You can see here, the people that didn't quit actually were smoking just about half the amount of cigarettes at the end of our 4-month follow-up. So you can see that their craving sustained, but it didn't go back up to their baseline levels. And that's probably because they still weren't smoking as much, even if they didn't quit completely. So if you bring this back to our model, instead of avoiding cues or creating substitute behaviors, it seems that psychologically we're seeing mechanistically that mindfulness is actually decoupling craving and smoking. And in this sense, you would expect a longer term behavior change, which we're seeing at the 4-month follow-up. Again, predicted by the early suttas, the destruction of craving conquers all suffering. So we see a good behavioral outcome, and then we ask ourselves, well, what's the best way? Should we teach people to disseminate this? And I won't go through the data, but there are actually some good data from groups at Yale, Kathy Carroll leading a lot of these studies, showing that therapists don't adhere to therapy very well. If you give them a manualized treatment, they can get trained in it, but they don't follow it, because therapists like to do therapy. They're good at doing therapy, but they're not great at doing manualized therapy. So we said, well, let's scrap that. Let's see if we can go to something that we can manualize, and we can actually bring it to people when they actually have cravings. So this is where we developed the iPhone app that we call Craving to Quit. You can actually package this stuff. You can cut it into bite-sized pieces, give it continuously over 21 days because they don't have to come into your clinic. You can have these daily modules. Their animations, I'll give you an example of this. We can even do in vivo exercises where people can smoke mindfully. We can't do that in our clinic because it's a smoke-free environment. And we can also embed experience sampling, so we can collect data in the best way possible, which is at the point of contact, at the point of craving. So we can test efficacy. So let's see. This will just give you a minute and a half kind of overview that shows how all this fits together with some peppy music.
Welcome to Craving to Quit, a 3-week program that will help you quit smoking. This training, delivered live at Yale University, has been shown to be twice as effective as other quit smoking therapies. Now I'll walk you through the basic idea about how habits are formed. First, recognize that the wanting or craving is coming on and relax into it.
And I'll give you an example of what the animations look like. We worked with 2 animators who both paradoxically had quit smoking using mindfulness before we met them, and they said, we are happy to help with this. So here's an example of how we teach this.
Today we're going to explain cravings through the metaphor of a screaming child. I know you've heard and seen a child throwing a tantrum. Perhaps for some of you, it was your own child. This child is screaming because he wants something. And you as the parent want him to stop screaming. All your child wants is a lollipop. So in this metaphor, think of your cravings as the child's tantrum. The lollipop is like the cigarettes. But what should you do? Yell at the child? That might make things worse. Gag the child? That will stop the screaming in the short term, but you know what will happen as soon as you take the gag away. You could just give him a lollipop. Congratulations, you've just taught your child to scream for lollipops. In other words, you just taught him that screaming is a good way to get what he wants. What might you do instead? Here's a novel concept. Just let him scream himself out. What? Have you ever seen a child scream forever? Sometimes they scream so hard and so long that you think their head, or your head, might explode. But it never does. What happens instead? Eventually, the child gets tired and stops.
So the idea is that you can deliver this in different ways that are engaging to people, and they can learn these trainings through the app. I'll just show you one other thing. The RAIN exercise was drawn directly from our randomized control trial, showing that this was the piece that predicted outcomes. So we can give that exercise, so recognizing cravings, allowing them to be there, investigating, becoming curious about them, and then labeling them from moment to moment. So this is tightness, this is tension, this is burning, and noticing that these are just body sensations instead of a moral imperative to smoke. We can deliver these right through what we describe as our wantometer. So anytime you want a cigarette, you can get right to the RAIN exercise. So this is a way that we can start to take these evidence-based treatments and move them into people's hands in a way that's easily scalable and disseminatable. And I think we're rolling this out. So it's the community wellness. Community wellness at MIT Medical is actually using this a bit. So if there are any graduate students or any of you don't have to raise your hand that smoke, you can actually get this and use it through MIT, through the community health group there. Also, if you want to learn more about these types of things, we do take interns. So if you're interested in any of this, just talk to me afterwards. So this is I'm going to segue now from the clinical now into the neurobiological mechanism. So how does this actually work? So mindfulness has been studied in a number of different ways. It's been shown to improve attentional focus, cognitive flexibility, reduces affective reactivity, so you don't get caught up in your affective reactivity as much. And even people describe it as modifications or shifts us away from a distorted or exaggerated self-view. But what's actually going on in the brain? So a good way to think about this is, well, let's start with the opposite of mindfulness. How about mindlessness, or getting caught up in our own selves? So how many of you remember Lolo Jones? Okay, several of you. So she ran hurdles, I think, in the 2008 and 2012 Olympics. Well, she was actually favored to win the 2008 Beijing Olympics. But what do you remember? What do you remember about her? She tripped at the end. Yeah, so she was at the 9th of 10 hurdles, and she was in the lead. And what happened? In an interview with Time Magazine, she said, "I was just in an amazing rhythm, and I knew at one point I was winning the race. It wasn't like, oh, I'm winning the Olympic gold medal. It just seemed like another race. And then there was a point after that where I was telling myself to make sure my legs were snapping out, so I overtried. That's when I hit the hurdle." How do you overtry when you're in the lead? I mean, I'm sure this was a really tough point for her. But the idea here is that she got in her own way. Instead of letting her body do what it had trained to do, to be perfect for this shining moment in history, she tripped herself up, literally. She got in her own way, and she finished 7th. So the important point here is not that she was thinking, as you noticed, she said, oh, I was noticing that I'm winning, but it's when she caught up in her thinking, oh, I need to change something. I need to make sure that I keep my legs snapping out. Now, you can think of this in terms of underperformance. Daydreaming is one example of this. When we can get caught up in our own selves or trip ourselves up when we're stressed out, and the extreme form of this is addiction. So how likely, and this actually happens so much of the time that it becomes our default mode. So we are lost in our own thinking so much that you can measure this through fMRI, and it turns out that this was found serendipitously about a decade ago. Mark Rakel's group at WashU had first kind of studied this as a resting state, and they found that there was a network of brain regions that actually fired together quite a bit. And this was when you're just asking people to not do anything in particular. So what do we do when we don't do anything in particular? We start thinking about ourselves, right? What am I going to... Maybe I'll post this experiment on Facebook when I finish it, or whatever we do. So I'm going to point out two key brain structures again, the medial prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate. I mentioned those earlier in terms of the hot processing system. And actually, there's a great study. I think Sue's actually here. So Sue Whitfield-Gabrielli did this study that needed to be done 10 years earlier, where she basically had people lay in the scanner, not do anything in particular, so do this basic resting state. And then she also had them do another task where she had them look at adjectives and just, or see if these describe them or not. And she found that there was overlap right in these two brain regions, the medial prefrontal cortex and the posterior cingulate, really helping us see that, yes, when we are resting and not doing anything in particular, the predominant method, activation here is us thinking about ourselves. So posterior cingulate, medial prefrontal cortex. Did I get that right, Sue? Good enough. All right. Now, it's really interesting. The default mode network, these two main nodes, they're highly coupled. So when one fires, the other fires. And you can see that this is a correlation map of functional connectivity is how it's typically described. So when one fires, the other fires. This is in contrast to other regions or other networks. This in particular is the dorsal anterior cingulate, which is involved in self-monitoring or conflict monitoring. So it makes sense if you're daydreaming, you're not monitoring. So when these fire, then this one's going to be quiet. So just keep this in mind as we go through our data in a little bit. So we studied 3 different types of meditation practices. This is way too small to read, so just think of this as paying attention to your breath is a typical concentration meditation. You pay attention to your breath. When your mind wanders, you bring it back. Another one that we studied is called loving kindness, which is very similar to prayer. You intentionally wish well to others. And then a third one that's often described as a more advanced practice is choiceless awareness. So you're just aware of whatever comes into your awareness. You don't focus your attention on a phrase or your breath. You just receive whatever comes in your awareness as your object. So you can think of this as attention that's directed to a single object, directed to physical and mental objects, because the feeling of loving kindness is often the focus there. And then this is focused attention still, but it's not focused on anything in particular. So you could argue that the task of mindfulness, the task of common to all these meditations, is the training of attention away from self-reference and more toward one's immediate experience. So don't feed the self. So our first studies was 12 experienced meditators and 12 novices. The experienced meditators, a lot of hours, 10,000 hours on average. And what we had them do was we had them lay still in the scanner, not do anything in particular, so we could actually measure some of this default mode network. We gave them the instructions of all 3 of these in a randomized order and had them do it twice. And the short answer is when you compare novice and experienced meditators, you see a specific deactivation in the 2 main nodes of the default mode network. So blue means quieter in experienced meditators compared to novices. And if you look at each of these regions, you can see across all 3 meditations, you get a deactivation in experienced meditators compared to controls. Here's in the medial prefrontal cortex and here in the posterior cingulate. Now, these data were somewhat different than what others had published previously, so we did a replication study, twice the number of subjects, and we even varied the baseline to see if we could see, okay, was this baseline dependent on what the baseline was? And the short answer is you can see, again, a decreased activation in the posterior cingulate with both of our baseline. We had an active baseline, and we also had just an eyes open rest baseline. So this seems relatively reproducible. Now, bringing this specifically to love or loving kindness, it's really interesting, and this paper actually just came out the week of Valentine's Day. What was that, last week? It's not about you at all when you're practicing loving kindness meditation. It's a selfless type of love, and that's exactly what we see. Again, you see large deactivation in the self-referential nodes of the network. So it's really interesting, very different than romantic love. So it seems that we see a specific deactivation of the default mode network during meditation that's common to different meditation techniques. This is reproducible. But we can then ask, do state changes during meditation correlate with changes in default brain activation patterns after a lot of practice? So basically, we can look at functional connectivity, which regions are talking to each other, and this also helps us to control for the control state. So you control for your baseline. We took a seed region, so you have to start with a region and you say, okay, I want to look at this region and what else is talking to it. And you can see here in controls, we took the posterior cingulate, and the white bar here is the baseline condition. And you can see controls show an anti-correlation between the posterior cingulate and the dorsal anterior cingulate, which is the same region I showed you earlier, are typically anti-correlated. We see that here. They're anti-correlated at baseline in controls. Well, it's really interesting. In meditators, we don't see an anti-correlation at all. They're actually correlated. So these guys are monitoring even when they're not doing anything in particular. And you can see the same type of connectivity with meditations. It's not just the baseline, it's during meditation as well. When you look at these more cognitive control regions, it gets even more interesting. So you can see, again, anti-correlation. So they're not doing any cognitive control, or if you think of dorsolateral prefrontal cortex as working memory, they're just daydreaming or thinking about themselves or whatever. Meditators, again, we see an increased connectivity at baseline. So this is at baseline. Now, when they're meditating, there's not a statistically significant difference between the groups. But it's not because the meditators are decreasing their connectivity, it's that the controls are actually increasing their connectivity during this task. So you could argue here that we're seeing a different default mode. It's the meditator, if you think of baseline and meditation as two different tasks, the novices are showing differences, but the meditators are showing the same thing. It's task independent. Now, there's a paper that just came out last year that starts to talk about mechanistically what's going on and how this actually relates to behavior and in real life. So you can see here the dorsal anterior cingulate has been shown, they just basically did an attention or cognitive control task. And you can see here that there's this behavior enhancing. The more the dorsal anterior cingulate, they call it, suppresses the posterior cingulate, the better your behavior is. The more the posterior cingulate comes in and gets in the way of your monitoring regions, the worse your performance is. So this is behavior degrading. And you can see these correlations are almost too good for neuroimaging data, but they look great. The correlations look very good. So you can see mechanistically that we're starting to see an interaction between these two. The dorsal anterior cingulate comes in, I don't like to think of it as suppressing the PCC, but that's typically how it's described. In the opposite's true. We can kind of come in and muck ourselves up. So this starts to come together, but we're conservative in our lab, so we wanted to follow Richard Feynman's advice. And for those of you that aren't familiar with him, he was a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, and he wrote some really fabulous books. I'd highly recommend Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman, if you want a good read. We moved into using real-time neurofeedback just as a way to corroborate our results, to really fine-tune what we were seeing. So we can have people meditate, and we can give them active feedback from a region now that we've got a region to look at. We can also give them dummy feedback to control for that, and I'm not going to go into all the details there. And the idea is that we can scan their brain every 2 seconds, and we can look to see how it changes from baseline. The baseline we gave them was a word task. Look at the word, see if it describes you or not. So we could try to get the novices and the experienced meditators doing the same type of baseline. There were 22 per group in this study. And what they would see visually, so they meditate with their eyes open, and they would see this graph start to fill in over time, over a 3-minute period. And what we did in the first experiment was just to ask them to see how well the graph correlated with their experience of self-referential activity, which we said, if your mind wanders, if you get caught up experience, or if you're concentrating on your breath, does that correlate with the blue in the graph? Novices said that the correspondence was very good, almost 8 out of 10, and experienced meditators reported the same thing. Now, this is interesting. I'm not much of a statistician, but even I can tell the difference between these experienced meditators and the novices. And in several of the experienced meditators, we saw this trend where they're actually learning to meditate with their eyes open, watching their brain in real time. That's not your typical Zendo experience. So you can actually see this person, they learned, and then they could just nail it by the 4th run. I'm going to give you an example of, and we had them report on their experience after every single run so we could line this up. So here's an experienced meditator. He said, so at the beginning I caught myself, I was sort of trying to guess when the words were going to end. This was the baseline, and when the meditation was going to begin. So I kind of trying to okay, ready, set, go. And then there was another word, and I was like, oh shit. And there's this red spike you see here at the beginning. And then I sort of immediately settled in, and I was really getting into it. And then I thought, oh my gosh, this is amazing. It's describing exactly what I'm saying. And then you see this red spike. And I was like, okay, don't get distracted, and then got back into it. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is unbelievable. It's exactly what my mind is doing. And so he was laughing at this point. He said, it's really funny. the next question is, it's a perfect map of what my mind was going through. So I would actually argue, well, what exactly was his mind going through? So what exactly does the posterior cingulate correlate with? So it's really interesting because there are a ton of studies out there. I'm not going to go through all of these, but there are a ton of studies that show that you get activation of the posterior cingulate cortex. So one is when you're resting and not doing anything in particular, first shown by Mark Rakel, highlighted by the study that Sue did a couple of years ago. When you're mind wandering, when your attention gets disrupted, when you start thinking about yourself in the past or future, when you judge yourself or take trait adjectives to see if they describe you. This also gets activated with social attribution in social situations. When you like the choice that you made, this is called choice justification. When you do prevention goals, so when you are trying to not eat that extra cookie to lose weight, that's a prevention goal. It activates the posterior cingulate. When you induce immoral behavior, when you get people to lie about or think that they're lying to somebody or making some phrase up to lie to somebody in the scanner, this activates the posterior cingulate. Relatedly, care and justice issues, guilt. I think you get the idea. Emotional processing. All these types of things activate the posterior cingulate. And of course, my favorite, craving, also activates the posterior cingulate. So this is kind of summed up in this graphical depiction in this meta-analysis. You can see a lot of self-referential stuff, autobiographical, personal, both positive and negative. All of these will activate the posterior cingulate. So can we actually take a deeper dive in the posterior cingulate? What's actually going on? So it gets activated during a number of cognitive states. It's seen across multiple populations, and it also gets deactivated during mindful states. But what exactly does posterior cingulate activity correlate with? So this is, again, where neurofeedback can help us. I mean, it can help us as a cognitive neuroscience tool, even as much as a tool for studying meditation. So there's this field called neurophenomenology where you can actually use first-person self-report to better understand cognitive process, but you need to relate these to some psychophysiological correlate. So we can actually use what's called grounded theory method, where we can take people's self-report of their meditative states in this and non-meditative states in the scanner, and we can code these and we can derive theory from these empirical data. So here's just an example. We can take all of their descriptions, so acceptance, calm, tranquility, relaxation, thinking about an object, emotion, all this stuff, and you can break it down into more, or group them into more central codes, and then group these into more theoretical codes. So you could say, for example, all of these line up with displeasure, efforting, and then these would line up with discontentment. So what's actually going on with the posterior cingulate? Well, we see with posterior cingulate activation a number, and these are just the number of instances, the number of data points that we had. So you can see when people are distracted, 64 instances of reported distraction, this correlates with activation of the posterior cingulate. So that makes sense when you're mind wandering. Other people have shown that. But a whole other category came out of this that we just called theoretically as controlling. When you're efforting, when you're discontent, when you're trying to change something, this also activates the posterior cingulate. Here's an example. I was worried that I wasn't using the graph as an object, so I tried to look at it harder. How do you try to look at something harder? Or somehow pay attention to it more? So this activated the graph in this second half of the run. So the corollary here is also deactivation. So again, replicating previous data, lots of examples of concentration. This correlated with posterior cingulate deactivation. But again, this other category of effortless doing came out of our data, which we hadn't seen before. So when people describe not efforting when they were content, this also induced a deep deactivation of the posterior cingulate. Here's an example. Toward the middle, I had some thoughts, which I don't see on the graph, maybe because I just let them flow by. Or the other one, I noticed the more I relaxed and stopped trying to do anything, the bluer it went. Stop trying to do anything. So the idea here is, and actually Sue and a postdoc of mine and I just wrote a paper on this about, what exactly is it about the self is processed in the posterior cingulate. And the idea is the parsimonious answer here is that this idea, and it's more of a felt sensation of getting caught up in experience, seems to line up with all these different studies of both activation and deactivation. You can think of it as mental contraction as well. And I think Suzuki Roshi put it nicely. He said, life is like an art, and like perfect art, it should be self-forgetting. There ought not to be any trace of effort or painful feeling. As soon as there are signs of elaboration, a man is doomed. No more able to be a free being. So this is interesting. And this brings us to the last thing that I'll talk about, which probably many of you are familiar with, is flow. So Csikszentmihalyi described this as a mental state when a person is fully immersed in the present, feeling of energized focus. They're completely out of their own way. And we were seeing instances in our scanner where people were spontaneously reporting flow. Here's one example. Sense of flow, being with the breath, flow deepened in the middle. And you can see here just a large deactivation of the posterior cingulate. So really interesting ways that we can use neurofeedback as a way to confirm cognitive neuroscience experiments and really dive in neurophenomenologically to see how subjective experience lines up with brain activity. Well, I'm a clinician, so you might say, well, they studied 10,000-hour meditators. Are you kidding? I have to practice that long to change my default mode? And this is where I like to turn to the legendary football coach, Vince Lombardi. He said that practice doesn't make perfect, only perfect practice makes perfect. So here's some interesting things that we saw with some of our novice meditators. So here's just an example. This novice meditator said, you know, I'm not sure that your neurofeedback actually works. I was thinking about my breath, but the graph was going red. And you can see this is first, second, third run. He saw a sustained run of red in the middle. So what do you think's going on here? I was thinking about my breath. He was focusing intently, and he was thinking. Yeah, so he was thinking. The very next one looks different. We didn't substitute his brain for somebody else's, but he said, oh, I get it, feeling the physical sensation of my breath rather than thinking about it. And he completely changed his brain activity in 9 minutes, right? It looked completely different. Now he didn't walk out of there like floating in an enlightened Buddha, but he might have gotten a taste of what it's like to get out of your own way. Here's another example. This is from an experienced meditator, somebody who had about 15 years of practice. She said, run one's interesting because after several minutes of blue, I wondered if this paradigm actually did measure self-referential processing. So I effortfully broke the period of resting and awareness and generated a sense of herself by saying her name over and over and over, while trying to visualize my face and a sense of myself as a subject doing something. This produced a large red spike at the end. Okay, it works. Interesting. Thank you for following our instructions. She said on run 6, I had a familiar memory image appear, one of a pond, willow tree, and fields of my parents' farm. I noticed that strong red deflection in response to this, although I don't appear in the image. I went back to the image to see if there was a sense of watcher-subject, and noticed that image had a sense of being seen through a child's eyes. The somewhat desolate feeling landscape corresponds to that child's subjectivity. So there is a subject there. Even though I never noticed it before, the scanner feedback made me look for it. If you look at run 6, you can see me exploring the image in the middle, in the long run in the middle. Then I remembered I wasn't doing the task, so I let go for a while. Then I started imagining myself in the future telling Judd about what I discovered about childhood memories, which you can see clearly at the second run of red at the end. She said, I'm sorry that I blew off the directions, but I learned something new and very subtle about those recurring memory images that I've had for more than a decade, something I may not have learned otherwise. So you can think, okay, wow, real-time fMRI neurofeedback. Do they have those machines on eBay? No, they're like $1 billion, and it costs a lot of money to maintain them. So the next step here is how can we actually move this into clinical utility? And what we've been spending the last year doing is taking EEG techniques that have been out there for a long time, not used in real time, but take these algorithms. So there's one that's called beamformers, where you can source estimate and get neurofeedback estimations using EEG in a way that's much more cost effective and also user friendly. So you can have, if you're claustrophobic, you can use this because it's just a cap that you would put on your head as compared to going into the fMRI scanner. So that's what we're currently working on, is actually taking this and moving it into the clinics. And we've got some NIH funding to start testing that with augmenting mindfulness-based stress reduction training, hopefully in the middle of this year. So let's bring this back to our model of hot and cold processing. When it gets hot, does mindfulness train us to be more aware of the heat and bring in our inhibitory control, or even just remember that it's hot so that we can tolerate it? Alternatively, does it help us turn down the heat when it affects us? We didn't actually see much evidence for this. But I would throw in a third possibility here. What if there is less, oh, this is the proverbial fire going down. What if there is less us to be affected by the heat? My mind is not at ease. Please pacify my mind. Bring me your mind and I will pacify it. When I look for my mind, I cannot find it. There, I have pacified it for you. So I'll just end there. This is a great Dogen quote. To forget the self is to be enlightened by all things. To be enlightened by all things is to be free from attachment, so this mental contraction. Free of attachment to the body and the mind of oneself and that of others. So I will stop there. Thank primarily our subjects, without whom we wouldn't have any data to present. Lots of folks worked on this stuff, and funding is always helpful, so I will acknowledge our funding sources as well. And I would be happy to stop there and take questions. So thank you for paying attention. It's a good question. We have a small startup company that is working on that right now. We have to make sure that the code works and that it's doing all of its things, but we haven't actually thought that far ahead yet. So we haven't developed it as an open source. I just saw a Kickstarter campaign where people are actually working on open sourcing this type of thing. So my guess is that other folks are doing that, and they might do a better job than we're doing. But right now we haven't thought about that. It's a really good question. Yeah. Yeah, it's a really good question. So is the activation of the PCC ever a good thing? I don't really know the answer to that. And I tend to, most of the studies that we've looked at have been ones where it's not been helpful. So I would say playing the odds, I haven't seen places where it's been particularly helpful, but I would throw in the large caveat that I don't think people have done enough of a fine-grained analysis moment to moment. So this is where I would want to see people doing some type of real-time feedback to really investigate the neurophenomenology of that. We only studied experienced meditators, and when their PCCs got active, it wasn't, it was in things that were causing suffering. So we haven't seen that with experienced meditators, but I wouldn't completely rule out the possibility that it could be helpful. Evolutionarily, going back to Darwin, there's got to be a reason that this happened. And one way to think of this is the development. This could be a way to learn to associate things with self. So, and Sue can talk about this much more eloquently than I can. There's some good data showing that the medial prefrontal cortex is involved in the conceptual self. And so what's the posterior cingulate actually doing? One possibility is that it's forming those associative memories where you get this little clench that happens when you learn, you associate with a memory, or you almost get hit by a bus, or something else happens, so you can learn, okay, this is the self across time. So maybe that's the experiential component of that, but that is baseless speculation, a lot of BS there. I don't know if you have any other thoughts, Sue, on that. Right, thank you. And related to the creativity bit, there have been several studies that have been shown that development network activity in this region has been correlated with creativity. I would like to see more careful studies done there, because they've often used tasks where people will mind wander, and the likelihood, so if you mind wander, say 50% of the time, and then you have a creative moment, there's a random chance that you're going to associate creativity with mind wandering. And so I want to see that controlled for it, because you could randomly associate. My old PhD advisor used to call this true, true, and unrelated. And you associate the two. So I think you would really want to look more at that carefully. In my experience, in talking to experienced meditators, mind wandering hasn't necessarily helped their creativity. Creativity kind of arises when you get out of your own way. And if you're mindful, you're more likely to notice what's a good idea and what's not. But again, I think it's an open question. And like Sue points out, there's some data suggesting that it might be, but I would say that my jury is still out on that. Yeah, in the back.
Hi, I'd like to ask the exact opposite of the last question. Not as the activation is the ever a good thing, but is the deactivation of it ever a bad thing? And I specifically have in mind something that you started off talking about, which is addiction. I've done work on that myself, and I was always struck in my own research at how closely the words that addicts use come to the words that those in a state of flow use. And indeed, that the criteria of getting into an addicted state and loss of self comes very close to all the criteria Csikszentmihalyi had laid out. So I wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
I can give you some more baseless speculation. It's a really good question, and I'm thinking back to my patients, because they often will use terminology like craving and caught up and getting caught up in their experience. One thing that you might be pointing to is where a lot of people use drugs to dissociate from their right. So they don't want to be, and typically it's painful memories, abuse, all these types of things that manifest painfully in the body, but can be cognitively triggered. So if they want to get away from that, they use drugs. I don't know if let's call this dissociation, but it's probably not. I don't know if that is clear dissociation or not. I don't know if that actually deactivates the PCC or not. I think that's the fundamental question that you're asking is when people are using drugs, is this deactivating the PCC?
I'm actually not thinking of drugs necessarily, but more behavioral. My own work was on slot machine addiction.
Okay.
And they described it as a kind of desubjectification. And then I was thinking about the apps that you introduced us to, and my current work is on self-tracking devices. And a lot of the people that I'm researching speak about how they're becoming a little bit addicted to the tracking and the logging. It sounds a lot like the slot machine addict, so that then loops back to the app design.
Yeah, I would guess. So, and I'm going to maybe broaden this even to the quantified self movement, which is really interesting. Yeah, so if that relates at all to the Facebook phenomenon, where there's some reward in posting on Facebook, there's some reward in checking in Facebook, that's why there are so many users. I think the quantified self movement is similar in that respect, because there's some type of reward in tracking yourself and checking your progress compared to others. Now, that is probably that's probably more dopaminergic, more of the reward systems. So I would say that's going to activate other brain regions and not necessarily deactivate the posterior cingulate. It might actually activate the posterior cingulate, at least in the pieces where people are kind of getting caught up in their experience. So it's a really good question. I would guess that type of thing is more of the limbic reward systems activation than, for example, deactivation of the posterior cingulate. It brings up one other question, which is, what are people doing? Like, for example, with PTSD, people will dissociate. They'll literally dissociate. Now, does that activate or deactivate the PCC? I don't know the answer to that, but that would be one thing that would be really interesting to look at this. I'll add one other piece, which is when you give people psilocybin, it deactivates, it's like a hand grenade, it deactivates the posterior cingulate gangbusters. It's like a 20% deactivation, whereas good bold signal is like 2%. So this is order of magnitude decrease, and people report selfless experiences with psilocybin. Whether that's helpful or not helpful, it depends on who you talk to. But there's a lot of work now being done with therapeutic uses of psilocybin, actually. And Roland Griffiths and his group down at Hopkins is doing some really good work there. So really good question that I probably didn't cover very much, but it leads to some really good questions. Yeah. Yes.
Are there ways for a novice meditator to meditate correctly, to know they're meditating correctly without the EEG right now?
Yeah, I would guess no. So we've looked at a lot of peripheral, like heart rate variability, skin conductance. We've looked and we've looked using our fMRI studies to see what correlates with PCCA deactivation. We haven't really found much of anything. Now, I would say novices can look at their own experience. For example, if you're, touching a hot stove, whether that's hot or not, because you're going to do this. And I would say that's really the only feedback you need to be knowing whether you're practicing well or not. The caveat there is that we often, and this is even described by the teachers, that we mistake, this excited state for happiness. And so we think that, oh, this is it. And it's actually just a state of excitement that just is samsaragenic. It just perpetuates the whole thing. So if you can see clearly that something is painful, that's all you need from your own experience. But the trick here is that most of us can't see clearly. And so that's why mental mirrors might be helpful. Yeah. Behind, yes. Oh, I didn't put that in my disclosure. I have that in one of my old slides. Yes, I do. Hi, I'm Judd. I'm a meditator. Have I brought apps in general into my own mindfulness practice? I've been practicing. I started practicing at the beginning of medical school. So when we started doing this research, I got in my scanner a lot to test it out. And it's pretty expensive to use it. So I haven't used this type of stuff to help my own practice because I have a long way to go, but I look more experientially. It's always available. And apps that I've evaluated a lot of apps and haven't found anything personally that's been super helpful. One thing that we had a meditation group in New Haven that used a thing called Insight Timer, which is basically a meditation timer that rings nice sounding bells. And the one really nice feature of that is you can get an online community. So you can really link to other people. So for example, they had the snowstorm 2 Thursdays ago or last Thursday. We saw all the people in New Haven. They didn't meet that night, but they all meditated together through the app. So that, I think, from a connectedness way is a wonderful use of an app. I've seen all sorts of apps from here's a thing that will go up and down and you follow that so you can follow, it can pace your breathing. Those types of things probably can be helpful. There are heart rate variability apps that I wouldn't necessarily recommend using as a meditation aid. Some people have reported that they've been helpful, but that wouldn't be the place where I would start. So yeah, unfortunately, we haven't found anything yet. Mm-hmm.
Thanks for the talk. I do some meditation myself, and one of the things that some books say and some teachers say is that you're supposed not to strive for anything too much during meditation.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm also practicing self-monitoring. So I'm trying to figure out how to bring it together because if you're looking at this feedback, right, you're trying to achieve, to drive it down,
yeah.
Right? Doesn't it go against, not trying to strive for anything?
Yeah, that's the paradox that I presented earlier. And we've actually, I don't have examples of that I'm showing here, but we've had people that their graph would go blue, and then suddenly it would spike red, and they'd be looking down and go, oh, look how well I'm doing. They would get this big spike. And when people actually tried harder to meditate, it was pushing them in the wrong direction. So I think what this can do is help people see what it feels like to strive. right? What it feels like to force effort. And that's where mindfulness is completely different than other cognitive therapies. The idea here is to trust that things will happen on their own, and that if you just get out of your own way, that's good practice. But we don't trust that. We don't trust that at all. Otherwise, everybody would be doing that. But the idea is you don't have to train yourself not to put your hand on the stove. If and putting your hand on the stove can teach you something. So by striving, by trying to do better, you actually can move yourself in the wrong direction. So the paradox here is, really, less is more? And it's not that you just lay on the couch and suddenly you'll become enlightened. But the idea is to pay attention to your experience every moment that you can and see what you're doing. You can ask yourself, what do I get from this? What do I get from what I'm doing? And is it leading to my suffering? Is it leading to other suffering? Or is it decreasing my suffering? Is it decreasing the suffering of others? That, in a non-striving way, that's all you really need, is to pay attention. And send me an email and I'll email it to you. I wrote a paper with my meditation teacher called "Why is it so hard to pay attention?" Or is it? But the idea is it's about reward-based learning and how you can actually they describe this in one of the earliest suttas called the Anapanasati Sutta, where they describe mindfulness, bringing mindfulness with curiosity together. And those create the conditions for 6 steps down the road for concentration to arise on its own. You don't force concentration. You can't force yourself to concentrate on your breath. You can try that. I tried that for 10 years. It doesn't work very well. But if you become curious, it's like reading a good book. You don't have to force yourself to read Harry Potter or whatever books you love. The concentration naturally arises, and that's what good practice is. So it's about learning to see what we're doing that is painful. And when we really rub our face in the crap, we'll see that it's stinky and we'll stop doing it. We become disenchanted, and that's what mindfulness practice is. Really different than go get them like I'm going to be an entrepreneur, I'm going to not, kill everybody or whatever, not, in a business way, whatever. I'm not even good at saying this. And I'm being videotaped. Awesome. Sure.
I was wondering if you feel mindfulness is ultimately a personal individual thing, or like what is the role of the individual versus the social? Because everything we're talking about is like a personal paying attention, regulation, epiphany. But then there's this other, you mentioned how cool it is to be connected with movements. And then there's this whole idea of loving kindness, which I guess is all about everyone. I guess I'm just wondering, could you clarify that, how those relationships?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for asking. So the question, and let me see if I got this right. So the idea is we're doing this individualistic thing. So the extreme form would be you're sitting in a cave meditating for 10 years. How is that how is that social? How is that helpful for people in general? And how are things like loving kindness or these social relatedness, how does this actually fit with the individual practice? Did I get that right? Okay, now let's see if I can answer it. The paradox here is, meditation practice in particular is taught at the end of the graduated teachings in Buddhism. So they actually start with generosity. And generosity toward yourself and toward others is a very socially interactive thing. And the idea with generosity is when you hold the door for someone and you're not looking for anything in return, how's it feel? Sucks, right? No, it feels good, right? It feels, okay. So if somebody holds the door for you, how does it feel? Yeah, exactly. So it feels good when somebody does something generous to us, and the same is true when we do generous things for others. And when you pay attention, you really see when you're not trying to please your boss or impress somebody by showing how chivalrous you are. It truly feels good when you're generous. The same thing is true with loving kindness practice. When you're truly wishing the well-being of others and all beings, it feels great. And there's a connectedness as part of that. And part of what this does, this relates to the self-referential bit. We're collapsing the duality. We're removing those self-other barriers to the point where we forget the self. To forget the self is to become enlightened. And that is, so that's where the individual, where we learn to get out of our own way, when we get out of our own way, we become more connected. And there's this idea in Tibetan Buddhism, compassion arises effortlessly and uncontrived, I think, when you're truly out of your own way. We are naturally compassionate beings, and this happens when we stop worrying about what we're going to get out of this. And you see this in response when somebody falls down on the street. Other people, like, they just reflexively go to help them up. Or these big disasters, where people are going, they're just moved to be compassionate. So it seems another paradox, like individual, but how does this fit with others? It's really about the individual forgetting the self so that they realize this oneness with all beings. Did that actually answer your question? Okay, you can ask the part B of what your real question was, because that I didn't get at if I didn't get at it.
I think that was the bigger question we asked me. The smaller question is, how do you do this socially?
How do you do it socially? Oh, sure. So should you do it socially? How do you do it socially? In Buddhism, they're described these three jewels. The first is the Buddha, or our Buddha nature. The second is described as the Dharma, which can be translated a bunch of different ways: the teaching, the experience, truth, whatever. And the third is Sangha, is community. And the idea is, if you go and try to meditate and try to tame your mind by yourself, good luck. But if you're in there with a bunch of other people, it can be really supportive when you're having a tough time, when somebody else is having a tough time. And also, there's just energetically, there's something about sitting with others that is hard to measure. We certainly don't know how to measure it, but people report this consistently, that sitting with a group is really important and very helpful. So how that works, I have no idea. That it works, I don't think that that's a question, and that's not specific to meditation practices. You see this in lots of groups, so that's kind of gets at that a little bit. Yeah, thank you. Good.
Thank you very much.
Sure.